When a massively multiplayer online game gets sunsetted, it doesn't just casually disappear from a digital storefront, it's actually systematically erased from existence, completely wiped out. That's what we're exploring today, the dark reality of the digital graveyard. It's this shadowy realm where entire living worlds, populated by literally thousands of real people, are just permanently deleted.
Picture this. The screen goes black. But it's not because your graphics card died or your internet dropped out. Nope. It's because a corporate server halfway across the world was simply toggled off, just like a light switch. This brutal, instant reality has birthed an incredibly high-stakes underworld of private server extraction. Out there, right now, digital preservationists are fighting in the shadows, bootlegging the exact worlds that corporations have explicitly marked for absolute erasure.
It's kind of wild to think about. Imagine buying a house, pouring years of your life into it, only to realize you never actually owned the land it was built on. As the unsettling truth of this whole conflict goes, you don't own what you buy. You only license the right to stand in a world that can be demolished without any notice whatsoever. And here's the kicker. This absolute corporate erasure, it isn't a glitch. It is a meticulously designed feature. It guarantees that when a game dies, its entire history, its culture, and its community die right alongside it. All right, let's move into Section 1, the secret handshake, looking at the Battle.net origins. Back in the day, the authentication required to let players online was incredibly rigid. Think of it like a massive digital bouncer at an exclusive club. First, the game and the server had to exchange a set of random numbers. Next, they'd calculate this highly specific, totally encrypted alphanumeric sequence together. Finally, they'd only grant you access to the game world if your specific CD key was actually valid. This super strict algorithmic process, that was the original secret handshake standing between a player and their digital world. But, as you might guess, players didn't just accept that bouncer. A group of volunteer hobbyists formed something called the BNetD project, and they systematically dismantled that gatekeeper. How? Well, they used a packet sniffing technique known as TCP dump, which is basically a digital wiretap, to log all the intricate back and forth communications between the client and the server. Then, using a program called Nextray and a so-called Ripper, they meticulously broke those client files down into their base component parts. Their whole goal here was strict interoperability. They were trying to engineer a bridge that spoke the exact same digital language, ensuring they'd still have access to these worlds if Blizzard ever decided to abandon them. Let's trace how this unfolded. In the late 1990s, Battle.net officially launched, that initial secret handshake. Things were kind of a gray area for a while. But by 2005, the legal landscape shifted violently. In a landmark Eighth Circuit ruling, Davidson and Associates versus Jung, the court ruled that simply by clicking I agree on an end-user license agreement, that giant wall of text we all scroll past, these programmers had contractually waived their fundamental right to reverse engineer the software. Jump to today, and Section 121 of the DMCA rigidly governs these digital locks. Which brings us to a crucial term you need to know. A technological protection measure, or TPM. This is essentially a digital lock that's strictly protected by Section 121 of the DMCA, and it makes any unauthorized reverse engineering a literal federal legal violation. With this legal framework in place, that old secret handshake wasn't just lines of code anymore. It was completely weaponized against digital preservationists. So what happens when this hits a boiling point? Let's dive into Section 2, the Nostalrius ghost, where Vanilla WoW gets reborn. 150,000. Let that number sink in. That is the population of a mid-sized city, right? Well, that was also the staggering scale of active users inhabiting the bootlegged Nostalrius server back around 2016. This was definitely not some minor weekend side project for a few nerds. This was a sprawling, living digital museum that flawlessly recreated the early vanilla World of Warcraft experience. It was a completely thriving ghost town for a version of the game that Blizzard had already meticulously patched right out of existence. Now, the conflict here was laid totally bare. On one side, you have the preservationists. They were driven by this deep cultural mission to maintain a digital museum of a historical experience that was otherwise going to be lost to time forever. But on the other side, you have Blizzard Entertainment, and they're facing a very real, totally legitimate legal obligation to protect their intellectual property. For Blizzard, failing to aggressively protect their IP would legally damage their absolute sovereignty over the game they created. Legally speaking, there was simply no clear path for them to just selectively grant a license to an unauthorized pirate server. So the resolution was swift and it was absolute. The Nostalrius server was completely extracted from the internet, shut down, and it left thousands of players actively mourning a world that technically never even existed in the eyes of the law. This whole event really underscores the absolute power of corporate legal rights over community-maintained, historically significant digital spaces. That brings us to Section 3. Digital necromancy, the actual act of extracting these dead servers. Let's look at a fascinating forensic case study. Metal Gear Online. When the official servers for this game went dark, preservationists Joseph Tartaro and Matthew Halchishak stepped in. They spent 10 grueling months reverse engineering dead protocols, having to rely entirely on client-side responses as a completely blind guide. The challenge was staggering. They had to forensically eliminate server SSL certificates and even embed fake age checks into the protocol, literally just to force the dead game to successfully phone home to a new unofficial host. It's like trying to rebuild a car engine in pitch darkness. And you really have to understand, these persistent worlds are massive, incredibly complex digital architectures. As the saying goes, when the corporation decides the park is no longer profitable, they don't just close the gates, they bulldoze the land. These games, they aren't just static files sitting safely on a hard drive. They are robust digital theme parks. They require live tending, active events, on-duty staff. So when they're decommissioned, they don't just stop. They face permanent, total deletion. Which leads us to the legal frontline in Section 4, the 9th Triennial verdict from the Library of Congress. Check this out. 87% of video games released before 2010 are no longer commercially available. Let me repeat that, 87%. That is a truly staggering volume of lost digital heritage, just wiped out. And this massive, quiet erasure is exactly what sparks the preservationist urgent plea in the recent 9th Triennial proceeding for Section 1201 exemptions. In front of the Library of Congress, the preservationists proposed a highly specific technical solution known as emulation as a service. Essentially, this method would allow legitimate researchers to safely study archived, server-dependent video games remotely, all without having to leave their homes. The core argument here treats these defunct interactive spaces as vital historical artifacts. They're arguing these games are just as critical to study as silent films or pre-war audio recordings. But, as you might expect, these historical goals clashed directly with the Register of Copyrights. While preservationists argued for essential remote access to study our 21st century cultural heritage, the Register of Copyrights strongly recommended denying the legal expansion. Their reasoning? They cited a heightened risk of market harm. They were deeply worried that providing this sort of scholarly remote access would inevitably bleed into unauthorized recreational play. So, because that expansion was ultimately denied, preservation remains firmly locked behind the on-premises requirement. What does that mean? It's a strict legal mandate requiring a researcher to literally, physically travel to an authorized museum or institution just to play a game that exists entirely as bits and bytes. It's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it, but that is the highly restrictive legal reality dictating exactly how the remains of our digital history can be legally accessed today. And for our final part, Section 5, the ghost in the stack, looking at the broader implications of corporate erasure. Here's the bottom line. The DMCA has turned digital preservation into an absolute legal minefield. We're living in a paradox where effective security measures must legally prevent the dissemination of worlds that the corporate owners themselves have already completely abandoned. This creates what's known as the constant tension of the dark stack. Out there, right now, preservationists continue to sniff packets and painstakingly reconstruct fragile protocols in the shadows. And they do it all while acutely aware that a single standard cease and desist letter could instantly wipe out years of their incredibly specialized architectural work. Ultimately, what we're looking at here is not merely an act of software piracy. As the community sees it, they aren't just bootlegging code. They are extracting the social, technical, and cultural history of the 21st century before the countdown hit zero. It is a desperate, ongoing race to archive digital sovereignty before it vanishes completely into the ether. Unlike a physical book you can put on a shelf, a server-dependent world is deeply inherently fragile. When the infrastructure goes bankrupt, the world simply dies. So, this battle for the stack, it's far from over. Honestly, it is just beginning. I want you to take a second and really think about the digital spaces you used to inhabit, the friendships you made, the places you explored. If you could bring back just one defunct online world, which one would it be? Because right now, your memory might be the absolute only place that digital world still legally exists. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'll see you next time.